It began with movement columns of cavalry, trains of artillery, marching bands, and generals promising glory. The war was supposed to be fast, decisive, heroic. But by winter of 1914, Europe's armies had dug in. From the Swiss Alps to the North Sea, a jagged scar of barbed wire and mud split the continent in two. Millions of men would enter these trenches. Millions would never leave. What happened? How did the most advanced armies in the world, armed with plans forged over decades, become trapped in a war of inches, mud, and blood? And perhaps more chillingly, was trench warfare inevitable? August 1914. The old world still clung to its delusions. Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, Imperial France, and the British Empire each believed that modern war could still be won the old-fashioned way, by maneuver, by morale, by bold action and brave sacrifice. Germany had the Schlieffenplane massive, sweeping offensive through Belgium, intended to knock France out in 6 weeks. France had Plan 18 headlong charge into Alsace-Lorraine to recover lost territory and restore national pride. Both were built on confidence. Both were dead within months. The early battles, the frontiers, the Marne, the Eisner revealed a terrifying truth. Technology had outpaced tactics. The rifle, the machine gun, and above all, the modern field gun had made open warfare suicidal. On August 22 alone, the French army lost over 27,000 men. It was the bloodiest day in French military history. As armies stalled, commanders ordered their men to dig in it as a strategy, but as a stopgap. Trench warfare, at first, was temporary. But by the end of 1914, that temporary measure had become permanent. From the banks of the Marne to the forests of Flanders, a line of trenches, dugouts, redoubts, and barbed wire extended nearly 700 kilometers unbroken, unmoving, and seemingly indestructible. The question was no longer how to win but how to survive. To understand trench warfare, we must understand what failed. The myth of mobility. Military theory in the early 20th century was still dominated by the cult of the offensive. In France, generals believed in élan vitalité, spiritual force of will that would sweep the enemy aside. In Germany, the Schlieffenplan counted on rapid movement, coordination, and massive firepower to encircle Paris. But none of the great powers had grappled with the realities of modern firepower. By 1914, the Industrial Revolution had created a battlefield from hell. Rifles like the German Mauser or British Lee Enfield could fire up to 15 rounds a minute at ranges exceeding 500 meters. Machine guns, like the Maxim and Hotchkiss, could unleash 400 to 600 bullets per minute. Artillery had become mechanized and terrifying. The French 75mm and German 77mm field guns could drop dozens of high-explosive shells on an advancing unit within seconds. The German 210mm howitzer, nicknamed the Black Maria, could obliterate entrenched positions from 8 kilometers away. A charge into such firepower was not valor. It was suicide. Commanders soon realized that shelter was the only chance at survival. As French officer Pierre Dupré wrote, "The trench gives shelter, untouchable by artillery. Well-dug infantry can only be dislodged by infantry and, properly, by enemy bayonets." But bayonets were not enough. Here lies one of the war's cruelest ironies. All the tools of defense were fully developed, but the methods of overcoming them had not yet evolved. Infantry still marched in columns. Communications relied on telephone lines, easily cuter couriers, who were often killed. Artillery support was uncoordinated. Spotting was primitive. Reconnaissance planes existed but were rare and vulnerable. And so, offensives failed. Again and again, armies hurled themselves against trenches, only to be mowed down by machine gun fire or vaporized by shell bursts. On the Marne, on the Aisne, at Ypres, at Champagny, story was the same. The defender held, the attacker bled. Even when breakthroughs seemed possible, logistics held back success. Artillery needed ammunition. In 1914, no army had anticipated the scale of fire required. French factories could only produce 10 zero shells per day for their 3,500 guns. Germany had burned through its 6-month stockpile in just 6 weeks. Shell shortages crippled offensive capabilities. Commanders began to ration artillery fire, a recipe for stalemate. British General Horace Smith-Dorrien later wrote, "The ammunition situation is hopeless. The supply can't keep pace with the expenditure. We are firing off the future." As shells ran out, trenches grew deeper. Reinforcements poured in. Positions hardened. Trench warfare was no longer a reaction. It was now the status quo. Another fatal weakness was in the brains of the armies, not just their weapons. The scale of the First World War shattered the existing systems of communication. Field officers were unable to coordinate with artillery. Telephone wires were severed by shell fire. Wireless radio was primitive. Signal flags and runners were slowed, often shot before they reached their destination. Entire divisions lost contact with headquarters. Corps commanders didn't know the positions of their own flanks. In some sectors, infantry launched attacks unaware that the enemy had already retreated, or worse, that they had walked into enfilading fire. German generals, deeply reliant on Auftragstaktik mission-type tactics that gave field officers some autonomy still, found themselves paralyzed when frontline updates took hours to reach command posts. French General Joseph Gallieni expressed it bitterly. "A few kilometers more of telephone wire would have been worth more to me than all the blathering on about combined arms and the unity of hearts." Warfare had outgrown the tools of control. The generals were commanding 19th-century-style armies with early 20th-century technology, and they were losing. This chaos further reinforced the need for defensive stability. Trenches weren't just protection from bullets. They were anchors of order in an increasingly disordered war. Strategic mobility still existed in theory. All the great powers possessed railroads, and indeed, rail lines were critical for moving reserves to plug gaps or mass forces for an attack. But once an army left its railhead, it became a beast of foot and horse. Infantry had to march dozens of kilometers a day. Artillery, dragged by horses, moved at barely faster than walking speed. Food, water, fodder, and ammunition had to be carted by wagon across roads that were often destroyed, muddy, or simply non-existent. By contrast, defenders operated on interior lines. A French division retreating toward Paris could be transported by train in hours. A German division marching through occupied Belgium might take days to reach a new objective, by which time the enemy had entrenched. This asymmetry doomed any hope of maneuver. The logistics simply didn't support it. German troops during the Schlieffen offensive often ran ahead of their supply lines. Artillery batteries lagged far behind. Infantry had to scavenge food from French villages to survive. One German soldier, Wilhelm Hill, wrote, "We have marched nearly 80 kilometers. A comrade shot himself because he could not bear it anymore. You can't imagine what we have to go through." The swift knockout blow had become a slow collapse into exhaustion. By October 1914, the Western Front had hardened into a frozen snake of lines and salients, bunkers and barricades. This wasn't the result of a master plan. It was a spontaneous reaction, a desperate measure taken simultaneously by both sides. Trenches emerged first at points of critical defense, hills, rivers, crossroads. Then they expanded laterally. Units dug in to protect their flanks. Flanking maneuvers led to more trenches. Soon the line stretched from Switzerland to the North Sea. No one had intended this, and no one quite knew what to do next. All the war plans, German, French, British, had envisioned movement. Not one had seriously anticipated what would come next, a war of attrition. The generals would now spend the next 4 years learning how to fight in this new landscape. Some would adapt, many would not. What began as a failure of imagination became a defining horror of modern memory. The trenches of World War I changed more than tactics. They reshaped society, culture, and politics. The human toll. By 1918, Over 3 million men had died on the Western Front alone. Many of them never left their trenches, buried by shell fire, lost in no man's land, or drowned in flooded dugouts. Shell shock, trench foot, and the pervasive trauma of constant artillery barrages carved wounds into an entire generation. The trench was not just a military solution. It was a psychological prison. The myth of the futile war. World War I is often remembered as a futile warman sent over the top to certain death for a few yards of blasted mud. There is truth to that memory, but the reality was more complex. In the trenches, new forms of warfare were born. Artillery, spotting by aircraft, creeping barrages to protect advancing infantry, poison gas, flamethrowers, and stormtrooper infiltration tactics, tanks invented to break the stalemate. Modern combined arms warfare, so central to World War II, was forged in the trenches of World War I. The tragedy is not that trench warfare never ended. The tragedy is how long it took to learn how to end it. Political aftershocks. The deadlock of trench warfare fed political upheaval. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, frustration at the unending war contributed to mutinies and revolution. In Russia, trench warfare helped radicalize soldiers and workers, alike paving the way for Bolshevism. In Britain and France, the war shook belief in imperial authority. The sons of empire had died en masse for ambiguous reasons and indecisive gains. The trenches carved not only into the landscape but into the soul of Europe. What began as a failure of imagination became a defining horror of modern memory. The trenches of World War I changed more than tactics. They reshaped society, culture, and politics. The human toll. By 1918, over 3 million men had died on the Western Front alone. Many of them never left their trenches, buried by shell fire, lost in no man's land, or drowned in flooded dugouts. Shell shock, trench foot, and the pervasive trauma of constant artillery barrages carved wounds into an entire generation. The trench was not just a military solution. It was a psychological prison. The myth of the futile war. World War I is often remembered as a futile warman sent over the top to certain death for a few yards of blasted mud. There is truth to that memory, but the reality was more complex. In the trenches, new forms of warfare were born. Artillery, spotting by aircraft, creeping barrages to protect advancing infantry, poison gas, flamethrowers, and stormtrooper infiltration tactics, tanks invented to break the stalemate. Modern combined arms warfare, so central to World War II, was forged in the trenches of World War I. The tragedy is not that trench warfare never ended. The tragedy is how long it took to learn how to end it. Political aftershocks. The deadlock of trench warfare fed political upheaval. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, frustration at the unending war contributed to mutinies and revolution. In Russia, trench warfare helped radicalize soldiers and workers alike, paving the way for Bolshevism. In Britain and France, the war shook belief in imperial authority. The sons of empire had died en masse for ambiguous reasons and indecisive gains. The trenches carved not only into the landscape but into the soul of Europe. We often think of trenches as relics of the past, rotting timber and rusted helmets beneath the poppies of Flanders. But trench warfare never truly disappeared. It only evolved. It reappeared in World War II on the Eastern Front, in the hedgerows of Normandy, and around Monte Cassino. It emerged again in Korea, along the 38th parallel, and in the sieges of Dien Bien Phu and Khe Sanh. Even in the 20th century, the battlefields of Ukraine bear a haunting resemblance to Verdun and the Somme. Each time, the lesson is the same. When firepower outpaces mobility, when commanders fail to adapt, the earth becomes the only refuge. The question remains unsettling and unresolved. Will the next war be fought in trenches too? Because for all our technological miracles, the basics of war have not changed. Steel still tears flesh. Mud still swallows men. and the instincts of fear and survival still drive soldiers to dig. As long as war exists, the ghost of the trench will never be far away. Thank you for watching this episode of Legacy Files. If this story moved you, if it changed how you see World War I, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, history is not just a lesson, it's a warning. Let us know in the comments. Do you believe trench warfare could happen again? Or have we learned enough to prevent it? Until next time, keep digging deeper.